Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Retomamos las actividades de la 12ª edición de Mextrópoli 2025, el festival que celebra la ciudad extraordinaria. Les pedimos tomar sus asientos para continuar con el programa. Esta es la tercera llamada. Desde Nueva York nos acompaña Shohei Shigematsu, socio de OMA. Ha liderado proyectos culturales, museísticos y urbanos en Estados Unidos y Asia. Su práctica explora la innovación formal y la capacidad de la arquitectura para generar experiencias colectivas. Demos la bienvenida a Shohei Shigematsu en alianza con la Fundación Japón.
Good afternoon, Mexico City. I love giving a lecture right after the lunch when everyone is kind of sleepy. So I have very short amount of time, so I will start. Maybe it was introduced, but I run OMA New York since 2006, have been doing many projects, issued this kind of variety of typologies and showing the process into a kind of full extent. And then recently there was a book about OMA New York again dealing with different typologies and experimenting with the magazine and really showing what we have been doing. I love Mexico, and I think there is a kind of common, of course, cultural sensibility between Japan and Mexico. I was a project leader then with REM. We did this tower called Torre Bicentenario in 2007. You might not know this because some of you are quite young. But around that time, there was a desire to build a skyscraper, the 300-meter skyscraper in Mexico City, where the site was chosen here, next, like west side of Chapultepec, in Las Lomas. It was a very small site. That means that if you built a typical footprint, basically a 45 by 45 meter footprint, then the tower actually goes quite high, like 400 meter, because it just doesn't fit. So what we did was to actually stretch the mid-datum around other skyscraper at the time, like 100-meter datum, and pulled that point towards the park. And that created this form, and then it addresses this kind of a belly towards the park and the sober side on the cities, on the Las Lomas side. So I have two, like clicker and sometimes I was pushing a pointer as a clicker, sorry. And here, this is kind of the other side. And during the process, we started to call this a pregnant building because it looked like a kind of pregnant woman. So we actually conceived a child, which was a void that connects the city side to the park side, never have a flat side, but bringing a natural light to the deepest point of the office building. So that became a kind of object that is hanging inside a very refined structural skin. And then, as you might know, there was a kind of protest started once it was announced. They probably didn't know that we were calling this a pregnant woman, pregnant building, but then they kind of started to compare quite precisely, and then did this kind of very poetic anti-skyscraper campaign. And then, in the end, it died. But you know what happened is that this is exactly the site, and then you know what's there now, which is like this building. This is, I don't know why, and as you know, you call this building a Doritos. We anyway designed it as a kind of two pyramids to put together, so I don't mind it, but it was not a great experience. I think it's actually quite nice that the upper half is always remembered as a kind of imagined half. I also tried in Hohutra. After the earthquake, we were invited to do something there. I was there. Initially, it was about doing something, some kind of housing or something, but when I was there, I thought the river was the kind of key element that is dividing the city, a town into half, but also the water was not really well engaged by the community. So what we decided is to extend the street and connect between the two riverside 100-meter bridge, and then creating a kind of public space that connects it to almost like an extension of the street. We only had a budget with 2 small public space and a 100-meter bridge. But we decided not to have these public spaces, but basically integrate the public space into the bridge and then save the cost, or basically reallocate this budget to the bridge. But even with that thinking, we could only use the ready-made beam, huge beam, for the bridge, we were told. So we decided to basically use that bridge and connect the two, and basically calculate basically the holes in between to actually have different moments within the bridge that you can communicate and or entice the activity within. So this was, how you can actually go one side to the other. It's double decker. You can go up to the upper side of the beam, or sit down, or other activities will happen within these voids. But then I was told that actually this ownership started to complain, so you can't actually have a straight bridge, so we had to bend it, and then this was the result, which I think is quite beautiful. And somehow, right after this was conceived, the government had changed, and we couldn't actually finish. So you can see how heartbreaking experiences I have in Mexico. But now, finally, I have something to show you. This is Casawabi. You might know Bosco Sodi, who has Casawabi in Oaxaca. As you know, Ando-san's building, his own installations. It's a beautiful place with Kengo Kuma's chicken coop, Caesar's brick-making factory, and Karachi's tower, etc. It's a beautiful compound with small pavilions of great architects. What we were asked by Bosco is to create a mushroom pavilion. Mushroom pavilion is to basically harvest the mushroom for the local food industry, but also to teach the local people to actually create an industry of mushroom making. So it's simultaneously a harvesting pavilion of mushroom, but also teaching educational facility. Mushroom, as you know, a variety of way of harvesting. In the end, of course, we did many studies, but what we delivered is a round shape, mushroom-like pavilion in proximity to Caesar's pavilion, and Kuma-san's pavilion is here. So along the path. The plan is to have these basically harvesting steps around it, so it's almost like an arena, and in the center there's a teaching area where you can actually demonstrate how to harvest. So here you can see all the harvesting from incubation to keeping it, and then this is a section where you have also small datum, a platform to actually oversee the site. So this is a shape, all in concrete. And then inside there's, as you can see, the steps to harvest the mushrooms. We're of course talking to the specialists how to harvest, and we're using this actual a clay pot that is also built, made in Casawabi. So this is how it will look. We made it also mushroom-like, also not to actually occupy too much footprint, because there are so many beautiful and precious species around. So we kept the footprint very small so that the green can actually continue growing. So it's this kind of bunker-like concrete with, we used the local sack to actually create a texture of local fabric onto the concrete. These are mock-ups. And here, the water contains a lot of iron, so over time, if you put the water from the ground to the concrete, it turns red. So we think it eventually will be red mushroom like this. And now, finally, this is actually happening. So this is just under construction. So now we are at this stage. The Hohutra Bridge, it's still, the design is, and the drawing is available if there is anyone who wants to pay. It's about $1 million US. So this is almost complete to the top. Okay. In my principle of working, I think we always look at the three fundamentals of the human, survival or human life. So food, clothing, and shelter. In Japanese, you call it ishokuju, like clothing, food, shelter, which I really follow to actually oversee what I'm doing in architectural field. So let me start from clothing. I've been involved in many of the fashion, let's say, projects. First one was in Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we won the competition to do the annual big exhibition for the Costume Institute, which happened in this Lehman Wing, which is basically not a gallery, but an atrium. So I had to present to her. It looks like it's not going well, but actually she liked it. That's why it happened. We basically had to create another building within the building to basically black out, because all the dresses are quite sensitive to natural light. So we call it the Ghost Cathedral, but we made basically a membrane building within an existing atrium. So this is how the plan is created, existing walls, and we created a round circuit where between the existing wall and the circle, we created this series of pochets that are our exhibition space. And how we made it within the budget is to basically use a very rough construction scaffolding for the armature, for the shape, and then use very refined scrim to enclose it. And this scrim is used in theaters, and this is how this has a sound. Sorry, I have to go back because it did something wrong. So this scrim is, if you have a light from the front, it becomes very opaque, but if you have a light from the back, it becomes very transparent. So it has a very complex level of translucency. We projected the Chanel dresses pattern onto the vault, onto the dome above, which was basically a blackout dome of the atrium. So you can see, typically it's kind of translucent, but if you project on it, because the light is coming from the front, it becomes opaque. We always projected the detail of the dresses, never the catwalk or the kind of model walking, because I personally think those are kind of distracting in a fashion exhibition. Okay, this was well received. So then I started kind of all experimentation projects for different brands, mainly Christian Dior and Louis Vuitton. So Christian Dior, I did Denver Arts Museum by Libeskind, Dallas Museum, and then Tokyo. And in Tokyo, I show you the kind of pieces of it in each exhibitions. In Tokyo, we were supposed to give a room about Dior in Japan, where they had a very, historically very good relationship, interesting relationship. So as a Japanese, how to design a room dedicated to Japan. So we basically looked at the process of couture dresses making. I realized that they actually use the kind of structural elements first and then make a shape and then apply a material, which I thought it's kind of close to, of course, architecture, but also this kind of Japanese traditional a festival, basically a kind of shape making with Japanese paper. They use this kind of lightweight structure. But also, Japanese architecture is tend to known maybe as very straightforward and stripped down and minimalist. But I think the garden is actually quite organic and, of course, in contrast to architecture, quite organic. So we wanted to create something very contemporary. So it's like a blob, basically, blob space where people go through. It's all covered in Japanese paper. So it's like this. So it's like a Japanese landscape in 3D, but also showing the movement of the dresses, which of course is not really possible during the exhibition. And also it's a surface to have some level of projection to tell the stories. Okay, and then in the same exhibition, we had the kind of, triple height space where we basically lifted of course, in this way you can only see it from one vantage point. There's a mezzanine in this atrium, so we made this kind of a tiered exhibition, basically a kind of podium where that evokes this kind of fashion show that was happening in the early days of Christian Dior on the staircase. So this was the result where it's like an opera set where the mannequins are on a podium where you can see from the ground up, and then the surface is a projection surface. We just did the same one in Seoul last month. This was in Zaha Hadid's DDP building. It's as in contrast to Tokyo, which was a gallery, proper museum. Here it's like an exhibition center, so there's no wall. So basically we had to create each rooms by ourselves. Here, one of the room in the center is called Garden. In Korea, there's this one called Moon Jar, which the jar is basically made, upper half and the lower half is basically the same shape, and then they put together and create one vase. So we were inspired by that. So there's a central courtyard where upper half is a projection and the lower half is a garden where all the dresses are like flowers. Anyway, the fashion exhibition is quite interesting. I don't go into detail maybe, but this is about color. Of course, it uses a different muscle or a different part of your brain compared to architecture. You are asked to make something more dreamy or more, immersive or quite narrative oriented. So, of course, some level, it's compared to architecture, there is some similarity. But I love the speed and the different way of kind of creating and designing and understanding that. And the playfulness of fashion is also quite interesting to apply that to architecture, I think. This is a room called Atelier where all the mock-ups, they use white canvas fabric to actually first make a mock-up of the dress. So it's all white, so we're kind of showing that. I always like that scene in Matrix where Neo actually brings all the weapons. So it's like that. It's a kind of infinite mirror situation. I even just did a kind of, Miss Dior is another sub-brand. It's a perfume brand in this Folsom building. It's Foster and Heatherwick building. And designing a scent, for the scent is quite difficult, but of course with a lot of history and kind of other documentations and archives, we could do it. So this is like a spiral screens and with some vitrines to show the history and the trajectory of how this perfume was born. This is as if you were in the flower. Each note of the Miss Dior, the fragrance is separated into different atomizer to actually be able to smell. This is the 60s. This is like a Chinese landscape in kind of layers, so it's like Caesar glazed glass plates that are making this kind of a scenery, trying to be locally inspired. Anyway, and then now I go to Louis Vuitton. Just as a short introduction, Louis Vuitton's success came from when before that, the trunks had a kind of vaulted top, where of course you can't stack them. So the genius at the time, of course, if you think about it now, it's kind of not quite natural, but to make it flat. That was the first invention of Louis Vuitton. But then all the other brands started to copy Louis Vuitton. That's why they started to use the monogram to basically distinguish their brand to the others. Anyway, this trunk basically is a kind of, let's say, crystallization of their series of innovations that they made, like a canvas, inventing the canvas which is light enough, using the very light wood so that the trunks are, sturdy, like very durable, but also quite light, etc. So it has a series of innovations. But how they are exhibited in the typical, of course, retail is that quite stable and quite, predictable stack to show their stability and, of course, their image of the, established brand. So I decided when I was commissioned to use one module only to do some kind of a series of installation and spaces, which we call it the trunkscape. So we basically came up with different shapes and spaces. This is the one in Bangkok where we used the trunk, only one module to create a tunnel with LED screens around. So people go through this space. Not too much explanation, more intuitive understanding how the trunk can actually be strong enough to be a structure. Here in New York, next to the Tiffany, where we did also, which I will explain to you later, here they do another store with a huge atrium, which we were asked to do something. I was inspired by Brancusi, which he also used, of course, one module to create incredibly slender towers, sculptural towers. So here, basically, I did all this kind of trunk towers that are 20-meter tall in the space, which, of course, there's a structure, but it's not visible from outside, so people have, of course, have some kind of wow effect. Okay, in the World Expo, I did open trunk stacks. So the trunk, what's interesting is also inside because it has an incredible amount of varieties. So I wanted to show that. So this is almost like a library of open, like an inside of trunk. So but again, it's only one element, which is trunk, to create a space, which was exhibited with Rodin's hand. So all the monitors are showing when at the factory the movement of hands of the crafts that happens in the Louis Vuitton factories. Okay, on the other room, there are two rooms designated for the French pavilion. So the other side was more for the future. Expo always kind of features this kind of futuristic spheres. So we made a trunk in sphere. We made the sphere in trunks. And there's a light source inside that casts a shadow. So this is the actual picture. And then it goes up and down and circulate within the void. So I don't have a video, but there's a projection done by Japanese artists. Okay. And then I just finished another exhibition in Osaka in this kind of contemporary art museum that has a huge void, where here we use the kind of all the trunks but are hanging, again, like a lantern, because we couldn't really build on the lobby here. And then when you arrive to a gallery space, you have this trunk that evokes the same kind of sphere, but it's half sphere so the people can go in. This is a room that shows the history. It's all hand-woven bamboo in Japan. This is a room that is all about the travel. So this is like an inflatable, all the structure here, the displays made out of inflatables. This is about Japan and Louis Vuitton, where we used a tatami mat to basically create this kind of landscape. There's an atelier. There's even a testing robot actually demonstrating the durability test. This is all mirrored dome where their collaboration with like Kusama and artists are exhibited. Okay. Now food, I did many projects. I did a study at Harvard about food. I was inspired by Broadacre City of Frank Lloyd Wright, where you see this sketch of his Broadacre City. It has a tower, incredible drone-like vehicles. It's quite futuristic. And this was his model. And this is what's happening in China now, the crossover between the city and the agricultural land. And I think this, the agricultural food production was always pushed out of the city, but now coming back to the city in different forms, rooftop or in the factory, as you know. And many buildings are actually considering food production integrated to their living nowadays. I did the food hub in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, but it didn't go through. But now there's one that is going through in Japan, which looks like this. In Tsuruga here, just above Kyoto, where used to be a port to bring all the great food to Kyoto. But also, that's the point where Japanese travel to Vladivostok to take a Siberian train to go all the way to Europe. So it was a kind of a gateway to Europe. The site was here where it used to be a water. Here you can see basically where the land line and the water line meets. And now it's a kind of reclaimed land with not such a great park. So we did studies and created this kind of a link that is basically creating a park, but also a building under the park. And then really trying to show that it's a meeting point of the land and the ocean. The program is a hotel, a market, and the food restaurants. So it's all centered around food. Okay, this is under construction. Living, sorry, the topic of this conference is living, but I don't really have so much to say, so I'll just show you what I did. Well, living, yes, I have so much to say, but sorry, I didn't prepare it well, sorry. So now, lastly, I have 12 minutes. So I would like to add, sorry, so confusing. The clothing, food, living, and shelter. And I would like to add shu, which means gathering, because I think the gathering starts, for me, it's a kind of very fundamental desire of human being, obviously. And then I think what I like about gathering is that it's unlocking architectural, programmatic kind of notion, where I think nowadays people want to gather where you are not supposed to gather. And for me, that's really bringing the kind of urban activity into the city, but also really challenging the notion of programmed, room like this. Of course, you need a room like this specialized for gathering and performance, but also this kind of ad hoc gathering or planned gathering is, for me, maybe pushing the typology of architecture into a maybe more interesting level, because everything is so refined and defined nowadays. So I'm been focusing on kind of gathering and the phenomena of like gathering. Of course, this is a little bit willful collection of pictures, and of course, like what's it called, the Burning Man. Anyway, so we love this kind of gathering space, and then somehow our commission, if you look at it, have so many gathering typologies. This is one in Miami Beach for Faena. So this is performing art, like a multifunctional performing arts center that has 2 volumes. No column free, all the structure is on, this is a tube structure, so you can see the structural pattern on the facade. One is a dome and circular shape, and one is a black box that could be connected like this. And here, of course, within a kind of art town, art city, Miami Beach became, there are not so many kind of performance art venues, so this is quite well used. But also, this kind of gathering happens quite often. Always a wedding, conference. And also outside even, of course, it has a kind of entry canopy void where it could bring people into the building, but also, of course, this kind of building can actually activate the surrounding too. This is another building we finished like a couple of years ago in LA next to a biggest synagogue in LA. This was a gathering space basically just for this, the Jewish compound to actually open up and have events with a community. So typically, of course, event spaces are sealed and concealed and boxed, but this is the other way around. All the event spaces are actually a void within the building, so it's visible. It's like an urban scale void. So you can see here, there's another one on the top. So this is like a tunnel that connects the Wilshire Boulevard to the historic courtyard behind. And of course, this is also a gathering space. People are quite creative to use nowadays with the technology and the desire of people in many different ways, even outside, obviously in LA. And this is the second level. It's a chapel where you have half inside, half outside a gathering space that frames the stained glass window of the existing synagogue. Obviously, of course, this is built for the event, so many events are happening. And the rooftop, there's a sunken garden, and the rooftop, entire rooftop is a kind of event space too. So these are some snapshot, again, a wedding. And all those voids are interconnected. Even in fashion typology, this was the old Tiffany flagship store in Fifth Avenue in New York. We did all the reprogramming and then came up with the idea to bring the event space and the terrace at the top. This is our intervention here. So even like the flagship stores nowadays wants a kind of gathering space and event space where, of course, you can activate and bring people, of course, with the commercial reasons, but still there is an exchange happening within. This is a museum in Quebec City, which sits between the park and the city to bring the activity of the city at the lobby space, which is column-free, so it's designed to actually have to act like a lobby, typical lobby in a typical condition, but you can house very diverse events. And so they're using it quite well for dancing, for kids, for music, for gala, again, a wedding. This is another museum we just finished in Buffalo, New York. This is a kind of glass-covered museum. So there's a gallery in the center, but we use the datum of the platform, the ground level, between the size difference between the ground level and the above to create this found concourse that wraps around the gallery space. So these are galleries. So this kind of open-ended space that wraps the whole building could be used for art exhibition, but also for a lot of different programming, which they do. And I think this kind of gathering and urban activity that in the city nowadays are more restricted with CCTV camera and many things. And I think architecture needs to basically invite those urban activities. And then we even made a courtyard, collaborated with Olafur Eliasson. This courtyard was protected by a National Preservation Board. So if architects say we make a roof, we couldn't do it. So we said, why don't we make art that looks like a roof? And then actually it passed. So you see how architects are not really trusted. So this is Olafur's idea of structure here, and then a canopy over it with a half mirror and half glass called Common Sky. It's also a kind of ticket-free zone, so they use this kind of space for many programming and gathering. And outside, not wedding yet. So new museum will about to open in December this year, or maybe we don't know yet, but hopefully this year. This is Sana's tower. This is our new wing. Before we started designing, we looked at different kind of relationship of a pair, because in this case, we had to build a new wing next to another contemporary architecture. So it cannot be a kind of typical pair, so we thought to find some kind of suggestive pictures before we started designing. These are some of the things that influenced us, I think. One is vertical and one is horizontal, that creating perfect balance. In the end, it's a kind of clone, exactly the same program. All the levels are lined, but has this kind of open-ended space in the front, which is circulation, but also some spaces for activities, community activities. Also, we created this plaza in the front, not just a setback in the top for preserving the view from the existing building, but creating a plaza at the terminus of Prince Street for contemporary art installation or for events. So the activity of the Prince Street basically goes up. So this is an atrium. Again, you can also do some art installations, gallery space. And then at the top, you have a production space, basically an incubator space, and an event space again. So this is an auditorium that overlooks the entire Soho. This is an event and education space at the top. Anyway, again, a kind of gathering space at the top. Because of the steep setback from the street level, basically upper half disappears, gives basically respect to the verticality of Sana's museum. Here, it's different views. It's about to open. It's a metal mesh, laminated glass. Okay, last one. I have 3 minutes. This is a skyscraper we finished a couple of years ago in Tokyo called Toranomon Hill Station Tower. It's right next to Tokyo Tower. It's a kind of weird shape, but one is a pyramidal shape, so basically tapering towards the top. And the other side is basically exact same shape, but 180 degrees. So it's merged between this kind of twisted center. That means wherever you cut, basically the area is the same. So that was very important for the developer, but you can actually have a very dynamic appearance depending on the area that you're looking at from. So from here, you have a top-heavy side. The other side, basically, a top is tapering. It's connected to a new metro station and a new bridge that connects to other skyscrapers on the second level. This is a concourse of the metro station, and then this is underside of the bridge. This is a canopy with Leo Villarreal's art, and then you can see the twisted center. And this is a bridge level where you go in and go through the center of the tower. Because of that, the core is shifted to the sides from the sky lobby in order to bring the public into the dead center of the tower. Collaborated with Sabine on colors. And then at the top, there's a kind of event space, gathering space, museum type of space called Tokyo Node, where it's an open-ended gallery space where they can do many different types of immersive installations or concerts or music events, again, installations. It has been open for a year and a half. They did many types of events. This is another hall where you overlook the Imperial Palace, which is also, of course, visible from outside. Here it's also flexible, so you actually do many types of events. And at the roof, there's a kind of infinity pool that again overlooks the Imperial Palace with the 2 restaurants on sides. And here also they do all kinds of events. Here, a concert on the pool. Anyway, I have 4 seconds, so I will finish. But this is a cool project in Miami Beach. We're restoring the reef along the entire length of the Miami Beach, but not just restoring the reefs, but putting the sculpture by artists into the water. So this is Leandro Henry, the Argentinian artist, called Traffic Jam. This is the first deployment. This happens in October this year. So we put concrete cars inside underwater, and basically over that grows the reefs. So that will continue the entire length of the Miami Beach. We're doing the master plan and also choosing artists, etc., doing signage. We also did the sculpture ourselves, which is like a series of spiral stairs put together as one, almost like a sea creature. Stair is, of course, useful for when you have gravity, but stair becomes obsolete underwater, so we wanted to bring that as a kind of platform for the reefs to grow. I think I like this kind of project that a lot of different domains and ideas and ambition actually converges: art, architecture, preservation, and tourism, etc. And I think this is kind of smart projects. I hope architects can also initiate it more. Thank you so much.
Nos acompaña Iwan Ban, reconocido fotógrafo de arquitectura. Ha documentado obras de algunos de los estudios de arquitectos más influyentes del mundo: Oma, Herzog y de Murión, Toyo Ito y Francis Queré. Su mirada se centra en la relación entre las construcciones y la vida cotidiana, explorando cómo los espacios son habitados y transformados por las personas. A través de su trabajo, redefine la manera en que entendemos y experimentamos la arquitectura. Demos la bienvenida a Iwan Ban, en alianza con la Embajada del Reino de los Países Bajos.
Everyone. It's really nice to be back here in Mexico City at the Mextrópoli conference. It was exactly, I think, 10 or 11 years ago that I was here last time, and it was kind of halfway during my career in the architecture field, actually. My background is photography. I studied photography in art school. I did for many years more documentary work on people and places and so. And it was in 2004, kind of by a coincidence. Let me see if the clicker works. I think my clicker is not working. Okay, by coincidence that I met Rem Koolhaas, fellow Dutchman, and I got mesmerized by the architectural field. Let's see if... Is that working? Technical problems, okay. Maybe I can do it here on the computer. So it was 2004, at the start of the construction of the CCTV tower, and I thought it could be an interesting look at what was happening in China. At that moment, like China was sort of gearing up towards the Olympic Games, and there were all these massive projects happening in the city. Like all these buildings coming up, the Olympic Stadium, and what I saw like with this project was like it was a piece of architecture where you felt the architecture already long before a building was really there. And there was this massive influx of migrant workers who were there living on site, working day and night basically to make these massive icons. So I started going a lot there to China, seeing kind of the change in the country, what was happening in the city there, how buildings went up, how neighborhoods were changed, and how these buildings almost were built by hand. And it was a fascinating moment in time to follow. And it was kind of a melting pot of architects there at the moment. Like so many people were working there, of course. Like there was so much construction happening. The whole country who was in this massive change at that time. So I started to work with Herzog and de Meuron, who was doing the Olympic Stadium, and constantly it was this huge juxtaposition of people living on these construction sites, having sort of all their everyday routines, and then at the same time these big icons kind of coming up as a kind of background on these sites. And like at the beginning, like these sites, like they were like also in a scale, like they look at a kind of almost archaeological sites, people doing things by hand, living there on these construction sites. Here, Stephen Hall's linked hybrid building, and that's like this clash of all these different cultures, like people still doing all the things they were doing, like in their villages where they came from, but then suddenly in the city where they were living on these construction sites. And building, these new cities there. And that kind of juxtaposition was something like which fascinates me always. And it sort of goes back to my old work as a documentary photographer, where you try to tell a visual story on these places. So then it became more and more architects. I started working with Zaha Hadid, and you have these sort of amazing architectural forms, but it's also like pulling out and stepping away and seeing it in a larger context of the city, where you see sometimes these big disconnects also, the big juxtapositions of this modern architecture in a very different environment. For me, that kind of stepping away, like, yeah, my bread and butter, my work is, of course, the architects who invite me to all these places. But once you are there in that place, like for me, what's interesting also to step away and see where this building is actually at, like what the city around it is, like how an architect envisioned it, how the neighborhoods around it kind of influence a building, a park, and so on. So that sort of, that kind of constantly back and forth between these personal moments where it's really about people and stepping away where it's more about the city, showing the kind of skyline, showing how an architect kind of envisioned an idea in that larger city context is for me an important drive to go to all these places. I started working with a lot of the Japanese architects here in Nishizawa's building in the north of Japan. And Japan is also like such an incredible, different culture and a universe where you step in and all these sort of moments fall into place. Like you can't imagine and you can't plan for these kind of things where like someone almost from outer space comes in to water the flowers. There's old people walking around. There's the new contemporary art. There's the new architecture, these very contemporary buildings going up. And there's constantly these juxtapositions of cultures and places. So the Japanese have been always a big inspiration for me. And then there's all these things you can't plan for, like you're in these places photographing these moments, and then somehow everything falls into place. This was in Naoshima Island, where there's all these great museums and cultural projects by Tadao Ando and many different artists, and you're photographing. I was working on a book there, and then suddenly you're photographing that Niki di Sanfal sculpture, and there's this boy starting to kiss the sculpture. There's this woman who appears out of nowhere almost in a similar dress, and all these kind of things fall into place. And the Japanese, their relation with nature and architecture, where it sort of always goes back, but also in a completely curated way, where everything has its place and has its connection between nature, landscape, plants, architecture, and so on. And we see here Junya Ishigami's underground restaurant and cafe, this incredible sculpted space under the underground, or then a park which he designs where like there's 50 small water ponds, trees which are all like a massive full-grown trees which are all planted in very specific way to create an architecture out of nature and trees. And that kind of back and forth and looking in and looking out is always a big inspiration here. We're in Toyo Ito's Taichung Opera House, this sort of sinuous, continuous form where walls become, floors become walls, become ceilings, but it's in this completely new built town with all these generic buildings, and where there's this huge contradiction between the new architecture and the sort of incredible developers push coming up. Stephen Hall's Knut Hamsun Museum in the north of Norway. And I like to go back to places also, like see them in very particular moments, like this was the opening, like it's midsummer, Norway, north of Norway, where like the day is basically 24 hours, like in the middle of the night, kids are still jumping off the bridge and swimming, but then also in midwinter, where this building is this almost silhouette in the white landscape. Ensembles, incredible sculptures in Tippet rice, and these kind of, going back and forth between working with artists and architects here. Olafur Eliasson in Doha in Qatar, where his sculpture is inhabited by all the camels and the locals, to like Christo, who is here at this, finally after many decades, his Mastaba project was finally built at the Serpentine Gallery in London, and that was the first moment he saw it, and he sort of stands there in awe at the end of the day. And I happened to be there at that same moment, and it's almost as if his shadow is sort of cast on the building. And as a photographer, you have that kind of relationship as an observer, but also seeing these very specific moments happening in front of you. Celgas Cano, the Spanish architects who I've been working with for many years, with their kind of incredible use of color, lightness in many different cultures and conditions. Here, this is a small school they did in Nairobi. And again, like sort of, stepping away from the architecture and showing like what that kind of school is there, but also like that neighborhood. Like this is one of the largest informal neighborhoods on the African continent, and it's just this sea of corrugated steel roofs, and something which completely organically grew over time. And I think that how cities are built, like they often grow over time in a very organic way. Here we're in Caracas, where like 70% of the population lives in these self-built communities, kind of draping all over the hills and going into the formal communities. But there's this incredible architecture which happens also without architects, which is incredible to see. And Tokyo, which like from far above doesn't look so much different, it's also like organically grown over time, like where the waterways become highways, which really inform these neighborhoods and how they are built over the years. Or Kyoto here in a very different way, where the sort of how parcels become smaller and smaller, but you still see the big imperial gardens as these massive super blocks in the city. Hong Kong, with all its high rises and its sort of almost generic city where Hong Kong goes over in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and the whole Pearl River Delta. Or Sao Paulo, with Oscar Niemeyer's building as a small architectural moment, and then the sea of white buildings. So kind of stepping away from just the architecture and show a kind of almost a patina of a city, I find really fascinating. Los Angeles in these very different conditions, day and night, where all the highways and the roads become this incredible grid over time. Miami, just like inches above sea level, and you can see what's going to happen there, but seeing that from above, you have these kind of realizations much more. New York, which I photographed so many times over the years from above, and where you see everything going up, and all these skyscrapers, the very tall and thin ones coming up. And then you happen to be there sometimes at a very particular moment in time. This was in 2012. There was this big storm coming over in New York. I had just arrived for another project, and the power was knocked out for 6 days. I happened to know the right helicopter pilot who could take me up and took that picture of the city, half in black and half still with electricity. And a kind of unique moment in time became the cover of New York Magazine and kind of made the rounds and is still kind of this icon for that very particular moment in time. So often this sort of back and forth, like of course architects bring me around the world to all these incredible projects which they come up with, but then you're there on the ground, you walk around, you meet people, you see it from the air, you see it from above, and your eye gets drawn to all kind of different conditions and what makes a city particular and special. So over the last 5 years, I was a number of times for different projects in Houston, and I became completely mesmerized by its infrastructure. Houston is just endless sprawl, there's no planning, and everything is right next to each other. It's these massive highways, you have like industrial, you have residential, you have the city, you have refineries, everything which is right next to each other, and then an endless sprawl, and like highways up to like 25-lane highways, kind of trying to bring people throughout the city. So then slowly you start to see that, you start to talk with people in these places, and they point you to different things. And over the years, I was there a number of times, and it became this body of work, which we just shown. It opened last week at Rice University in Houston, and we made a publication out of that. And that's kind of, that drive for people to build in all these specific places like Houston, which is prone to all these floodings and storms, and so like they have all these beautiful planned neighborhoods with nice water features, a fountain here and there, but all these water features are big holding basins for these storms which come over, because also like everything is just built inches above the sea level. You have residential neighborhoods right next to oil refineries, right next to the shipping yards, and there's this massive ship terminal there, where like you see in the top right, like this little green patch. It's a cemetery which was there already for a long time, and the shipping terminal is built around it. There's still a little road through the shipping terminal where you actually can visit the cemetery. But that's all these layers of history and time which exist in that built environment. The whole Gulf, which goes through the canal there up to Houston, where it's all industrial. So it's this massive infrastructure of industrial highways, residential, refineries, and everything is kind of right up there. And you see the proximity also of Houston and all its industry. It's the oil industry, which of course like built that whole city. Then just a little bit on the outside in the Gulf, you have kind of recreational houses, but right next to the oil refineries and so on. And again, everything just kind of inches above sea level. And then you're working on these kind of projects, and you get a call from the Maxi Museum in Rome, who was working on an exhibition on the 100th anniversary of the Italian highway. And if I was interested to do something with that fact. Of course, the Italian highways are something very different than the Houston highways. Like Italy, where like every piece of infrastructure is also like designed. The bridges are beautiful designed. There's the incredible history of the landscape, the old villages, and the highways kind of crossing through. So I spent a week in a helicopter all over the country, documenting this man-made kind of inscriptions through the landscape. And I tried to find a different way also to show that. So I had converted one of my cameras to an infrared camera, which capture only infrared light. And what's so special about infrared light is, like, it's everywhere, of course, but we don't see it with our eyes. But a camera which picks up that light sees that light gets reflected extensively from all the green and the vegetation, and all the man-made, the built stuff basically absorbs that light. So you get this incredible contrast between like the built environment and the landscape, where the landscape becomes this very light, bright, green, black and white landscape with this kind of black inscription of the highways meandering in a very graceful way throughout that beautiful Italian landscape. Here, Orvieto, up on the hill within the background, the landscape. So these kind of projects on cities always, bring me to these places. This was a book I did already 15 years ago on Brasilia and Chandigarh, two cities. At that time, they were 50 and 60 years old, and I was interested to revisit these places and see how people live with that kind of architecture. Of course, at that moment, like, architects have long left, and people who live there, they probably don't care so much about what they really live in. But and you see really how these buildings are taken over by people in many different ways. Every nook and corner is used in a different way, and that architecture becomes really this kind of backdrop of everyday life. And to see it at that moment is, yeah, you can tell really a story how that architecture made that place specific, like the big plazas here in Brasilia, where there's no shade and it's only the tourists going there, hanging out in the sun, and the big sort of architectural and planning strokes in the landscape, the central axis, the traffic jams which it creates and so on, but then also these architectural icons which make that city special. And as a photographer, you're there at a specific moment in time and you have to work with the conditions. Sometimes it's in the pouring rain or in the snow, or like it's also that moment in time which makes it special and which brings you at that moment, and you create something at that moment there. Over the years, I spent a lot of time in Africa. Both for contemporary architecture, but also like with Manuel Hertz, Swiss architect, we did this book on African modernism. And we looked at 4 countries which were all in a very specific moment in time, where they were as part of their independence, and in a kind of similar way as like Brasilia and Chandigarh, as a kind of nation building, hired mainly foreign architects, mainly architects from their former colonizing countries actually, to design their big government buildings, public places, markets, and so on. And there you see that juxtaposition even more. In a lot of these places, the architecture, is not in the best condition anymore, but it's also like used still very much. And like architects realized at that time also like that you can, you have to make something relatively simple and create something like which is gives shading, gives natural ventilation, but is not dependent on too much technology to keep it working. And it's like these bold architectural statements in these places, which still stand there in this moment of time. And then you go to places while you're traveling there, which are completely remote and show a very different part of architecture. This was a trip I did with Francis Carré in the south of Burkina Faso, where we visited 4 different villages, all very different and very specific. This is Tjebele, a small village on the border almost with Ghana, which is special because every year all the women, they make these incredible graphic patterns. They draw on their houses, their mud houses, and there's this combination of all the patterns they know from their dresses, from their clothing, which they replicate on the walls and on the buildings. And the buildings which are from this material, it comes right out of the ground there. It's something they can build with their own hands. And every year after the rainy season, they have to apply a new layer, and it becomes this kind of very soft building where the floors, the ground, these become walls, they become ceilings. There's everywhere these beautiful drawings inside and outside. And there's this big contrast, it's extremely bright and hot outside. These buildings have thick mud walls, very small openings, and there's very little light coming inside. So your eyes have to adapt to it. For the first couple minutes when you enter a building like that, you don't see anything, and your eyes have to adapt to it, and finally you see what's inside. So that became a book we did together, called Momentum of Light, and where we tried also, in these book publications, also to make something special and something specific with the subject. Here we printed half the book on black paper in 7 printing plates, where you literally bring the light on these on the black paper with first 2 white plates, 2 silver plates, and then bring the cyan, magenta, and yellow colors on top of it to create that kind of patina of these interior spaces, where sometimes you see what's happening and sometimes you don't, and it's kind of that reflection of light which brings you into that subject. So very often, as you see, you're there for one reason, and then something else happens, and something very different around the built environment kind of catches my eyes, and you come into a place and get an understanding of a place in a very different way. So this was 3 years ago. I was with my family in the northwest of the US, and we arrived in Las Vegas to drive out from there, and I get a call from the American Academy in Rome. Their galleries were finally opening after COVID, and if I had a subject which I could show there, something had to be done very quickly. If I had something ready-made, but they warned me, yeah, it's Italy, and the Italians, they love to see Italy, so it should be an Italian subject. And as I got that call, I was standing here in front of the Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, and I said, like, I don't really have anything I shot for an exhibition in Italy, but maybe we can do something with that idea of Italy and the Italian built environment abroad, and see how Italy manifests itself in these very different conditions. Then we realized it was 50 years ago that the book Learning from Las Vegas was published, which started at the American Academy in Rome. So then we decided, now let's kind of revisit these two places, Rome and Las Vegas, and see how they changed over time or didn't change over time. Of course, Las Vegas, there's nothing the same anymore from 50 years ago. The place, everything gets through this sort of massive change every couple of years. And then Rome, everything stays the same. But it became, of course, a whole story on, mass tourism also, and like how places like that become more and more the same. Las Vegas, this sort of extreme environment of entertainment, money, power, everything seems to be bigger than it is. And it's sort of, you walk around there and it's constantly this almost kind of collage of completely different worlds, and like I can't make that up as a photographer, but it's happening right in front of my camera. And then you see that juxtaposition with the surroundings, like you're there in the desert where there's little around and everything has to be planted, the trees, the plants, and then there's also a guy in a tree costume walking around. But that kind of the desert and the whole sort of man-made environment, from the buildings to the golf courses and everything what has to be imported and made specifically for that place. And you step into all these different worlds. Here in the Bellagio, there's this oversized fake garden where people come in, and it also attracts all these very specific people. So in that garden, it's only somehow women walking around in flower dresses, and it's just hilarious and fascinating always to step in all these different worlds where, like, otherwise I wouldn't come, but as a photographer you have a reason to be there and document what's happening there. And then, of course, everything is with this exuberance and references to Rome and to Italy in many different ways. But ultimately, it's only about that gambling and more gambling and money and so on. There's the Roman columns which are laying everywhere around, but with its modern convenience where there's a power plug and you can charge your phone and keep Instagramming. But you see also the superficiality of that whole environment, and everything is just that thin facade which is wrapping around buildings, trying to make it bigger and make it something people recognize, like the whole world is basically there, and it's only about that facade. And then when you step away and you see the back side actually of it and all the sort of strange juxtapositions and the unresolved details, you see the absurdity of the place, like the little piece of facade which is just plastered against a parking garage just at the entrance, and the rest, like, it doesn't matter really what's around it, and people just focus on that small part. So I'm always curious, and you start walking around, you try to see the backside of all these places, what's happening behind it, what's happening under the highways, how the homeless population in these kind of places. And there's this huge contrast with, Golden Trump Tower, which is right next to it, in this sort of endless sea of gray concrete, and then the sparkle, the gold is just projected in the gray shadow. And it is, these places have this kind of particular patina almost. And it's fascinating to see like how these things get bigger and bigger over time now. Like all these buildings, they become so massive that it feels almost as if you're stepping into a computer game, like where all these surfaces are just kind of endless repetitions, and like kind of mapping almost a surface with like the same materials over and over again. And nowadays there's the big new Sphere, the largest spherical building in the world, which is right there in the center of Las Vegas, which is all covered with LEDs inside and outside, which can project anything, can become anything, and you think like, you're not really necessary as an architect anymore. Like people can be in any kind of place, and as long as they have that kind of backdrop of a very different environment, they're happy and they're in there. And then you see the juxtaposition with this sort of incredible beauty of the desert around, and how these neighborhoods kind of start to creep up. And it's also one of the fastest growing cities in the US, and like more and more of that environment gets gobbled up by golf courses, housing, and so on. And then what makes that city work is places like the Hoover Dam, the water there in the desert, and there's this big solar farm which kind of looms there in the background. And then these new neighborhoods starting to come up in there. Then I spent 10 days in Rome during one of the hottest summers on record, and made a series on Rome, kind of in a similar way, of course, looking also at its mass tourism, how these places become more and more the same, and kind of a backdrop for that tourism. And you see so many similarities, of course, also big difference as well. One of the hottest summers on record ever, the tourists, everyone is dripping sweat, the fountains are running, but then the few sort of places where people rest, and so this is like under the Vatican, the food and beverage area, where all the walls are covered with pictures, and you could be anywhere. It's also kind of the same drab kind of environment underneath there, but trying to mimic something else. Flying over Rome, here I flew over the Trevi Fountain, and you realize also there are so many things the same. Like the Trevi Fountain, seeing it from this angle, you see that it's also just a thin facade kind of pasted against another building, and it becomes this imposing new feature, big feature, which like all the tourists come to take their selfies, rest in front, and get some cooling from the water. So it's fascinating to see like how all these themes come back in very many different ways all around the world. Like Rome, where you cannot do any outdoor advertising, like they figure out a way to do it anyway. Like once you have a building under renovation and you have your scaffolding up, you're allowed to put some advertising on, and then of course a building stays forever in renovation, and that's the big advertising moment, and it becomes like Las Vegas, and the building and that kind of fake facade is kind of spilling out underneath. So that exhibition was at the American Academy in Rome 3 years ago. Last year we made it into a book, And now with the book out, the exhibition is traveling around, and it will open up here on Sunday in the museum. Hopefully, at the moment it's still stuck in customs, so we're trying hard to get it out there and have everything up on Sunday. But also here, like with the book, we try to make something special. Like it's really that juxtaposition between these two cities going back and forth. So we bound the book as basically one big stack of papers with two staples through it, and it creates this beautiful outline of the book. And the first and last 10 pages are basically spreads which run from front to back and show one image front to back, but together they create this kind of juxtaposition between the two cities, where at some point you don't know anymore, like am I in Rome or am I in Las Vegas? And like these places become more and more the same. And I think that's for me the fascinating thing, like you see it all at once and all at the same time and constantly, and you work with the greatest architects, but you see also what people built out of necessity and how things grow over time, and that's something which drives me and which brings me to all these places, and I was happy to share that with you today. Thank you.
Estructuras de madera y sus diferentes derivados. Somos cerca de 200 colaboradores que día a día nos comprometemos por entregarte el mejor producto. Somos 3 plantas de producción en México enfocados en laminados, prefabricados y carpinterías. Somos la primera opción para proyectos de alta gama que apuestan por los mejores estándares de calidad. Somos 30 años de experiencia, pasión y compromiso. Somos el sistema constructivo más estético y sustentable. Somos MICMAC.
Desde Austria nos acompaña Dietmar Eberle, cofundador de Baumslager Eberle Architekten. Con sede en Austria y oficinas en todo el mundo, su estudio es un referente de la arquitectura contemporánea en sostenibilidad, eficiencia energética y construcción duradera. Su trabajo impulsa edificios de alto desempeño y larga vida útil. Con una mirada precisa sobre el contexto y el uso cotidiano, demos la bienvenida a Dietmar Eberle, en alianza con Centro.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon. Before I want to start, I want to say, first of all, very much my admiration for Andrea and for the organization of this event. I'm quite impressed by all these activities which are taking place in this one. And I see that there is something wrong. Okay, so when I was invited here, I was asked to talk about housing. And mainly I will talk about housing out of a very European perspective, on one hand, and on the other hand, housing is related to a lot of different social levels, and that's what I want to show you. What I'm interested in, what are the driving forces? What determines housing? And first of all, I would say that what is very hard to understand, that the majority of Europeans live in cities, the vast majority live in cities under 100,000 people. So housing is not mainly a question for the very big cities, but the big majority of housing takes place in quite small cities. Even when you go to China, only 11% of the Chinese population live in cities which are bigger than 1 million. So 89% are living in cities which are smaller than 1 million. So when we speak about housing, it's not only an urban question, it's a very general question. For us, the driving forces are very simple. It's about the atmospheres and the question, what kind of atmosphere the building will do to the place in which it is built. I like very much the richness of the diversity of different cultures, different areas, different identities. And I think especially housing should be part of contributing to these differences. The second, what is for me, the second big issue which I would like to talk about is cost. I think all over the world we have at the moment the same problem, that the cost of housing does not relate anymore to the income of people. So, and this is a big problem with a social, a big social dimension. And the question is, what does architecture deal with this kind of question? And the next one is, which kind of technology we will use to do future housing? And maybe that's also important at the moment, at least in Europe, that 60% of all energy use and its carbon dioxide footprint is related to do housing and to maintain housing. So when we want to reduce carbon dioxide footprint, when we want to reduce energy demand, we have to talk about housing. It's very strange, but all these big problems what we have at the planet at the moment relate very much to housing. And you know, in Europe, but it's not only in Europe like this, about 65% of all the buildings which are built over the world are related somehow to housing. So 65%. And that's quite a big number, and that's a big demand of what we will have to answer. So when I come back now to this first issue about atmospheres, I think we divide three very different dimensions of atmospheres. One dimension is the public atmosphere, the second dimension is the semi-public atmosphere, and the third dimension is the private atmosphere. My background about housing is something very simple. First of all, I built about 40,000 apartments in my life. And second, I was the head of an ETH research group called ETH, which was only focusing on housing. And there we always had about 15 people relating to questions of housing. So for me, these three different dimensions of atmosphere, it's very clear. The most important one is the dimension of relation to the public. Why do I say this? Look, I like very much this richness of Europe, having these very different atmospheres in very different cities. And at the moment, when we talk about housing, we do not consider enough these differences. But so we always try to give one and the same answer in very different circumstances. And I think that's a big wrong development, what we are doing. You know, the second very big space is the semi-public area. And you know, that's for us the space from the street to your apartment door. And this very short semi-public space determines in a very high way, in a very high proportion, the question of how good is your address, how good do you live, how do you feel there, who are you, and things like this. And about this private atmosphere, we have a very clear opinion that I believe the housing, what we should do, should give people opportunities to organize themselves in their apartments in the way they want. So to make it more pragmatic, I do not believe that the layout of apartments is an architectural question. And in future, for sure not. But we should develop possibilities which makes it possible that everybody can organize himself in the way he wants to organize. When we come to cost, you must understand the European situation is like this. At the moment, we have about 50 square meters of built area per capita in housing. All over, it's about 80 square meters of built area above ground for the whole society. So it is very obvious and clear that this will not go on like this. It doesn't make sense to go up to 80, 90, 100 or more. So at a certain moment, we must see that we have reached a certain level and where the future work of architects is mainly related to two questions. One is to increase the quality of the now existing building stock, to reduce the energy demand and carbon dioxide footprint of the existing building stock, and to make strategies which make it possible that people can involve them and engage them more in this, in their own environment they want to live in. The second issue, what is so important for me, is this question about land price, about funding, and about construction cost. These are the big three groups one should consider when we speak about cost. But you must understand one thing. When you talk about European housing, there is no European housing which is not subsidized by the public. This is very hard to understand. But without public money, European housing in the way you experience it now does not exist. And after these neoliberal economic discussions about 2000 in Europe, nowadays all governments, if it doesn't matter if they are right or left, they start to understand without the continuation of doing a policy of subsidies, it will not go on to manage the housing problem in Europe. And this is very important because the way how we live now is a document of distributing money from high incomes to low incomes. And you know, there are a lot of different strategies nearly in every country how these things happen. There can be strategies about taxes, about direct payments, about interest rates, about special laws and special organizations and things like this. So I don't want to explain, but this would be very interesting how you do this in different countries in different ways. And you know, the construction cost is very simple. And in the end, you can start to compare the cost of housing by a simple question. How many square meters of built new housing you can afford by one yearly average income. And these numbers are shocking because you cannot afford much more than 6 to 8 square meters with one income of newly built houses. So this is the political challenge, and I even heard this morning that in Latin America it's sometimes even much lower, that you need much more yearly incomes to finance housing. But why do I talk about these issues? That's very simple because for normal people, the key question for housing is the cost. And there are two different ways. It's private properties or rental. And maybe I'll tell you something for you very interesting, that the country which you think is most capitalistic, Switzerland, is the country with the highest percentage of rentals and the lowest percentage of private ownership. But this is a political issue. I don't want to discuss it. But this is, in the future development, this is quite important, how these things will be organized. And when we architects, and this is a very long discussion, what we have in architecture, what do we go for? Do we go for local craftsmanship, or do we go for prefabrication? And that you see how old this question is. Bauhaus was founded because with this idea to go for prefabrication and industrialization of the building process. The other group, which was defending craftsmanship, was arts and crafts in England. So this discussion, what we have nowadays all over the world, is very, very old. Okay, and in the end, what I have to say at the moment, most of the constructions which are done in Europe are the hybrid constructions, that you have elements which are prefabricated and you have parts which are done by craftsmen. And this is the last issue what we talk about now. This is the question of resources. And as I told you before, the buildings determine about 60% of the use of energy in societies. But to make it more pragmatic now, the first thing architects can do is by optimizing their planning. This will have a very big impact on the energy performance of the building. The question of the carbon dioxide footprint is very much related to materials. And as you heard this morning, at the moment we believe everything is done in wood, but in the end, we know that in a few years, concrete will be more efficient in relation to carbon dioxide than wood. Because there's a lot of research, not only with Holcim, as we heard this morning, but also quite a lot of other companies which will go for this optimization. And the third one, there's a clear tendency in the world that the future energy will be electricity. And therefore, maybe Bill Gates and the Chinese government, they do a lot of investment and research in new energy, new electricity production on different ways. Why do I say this? Because in very short time, housing will not be the biggest problem anymore, but the modern technologies which we use, like Bitcoin or carbon or artificial intelligence, there will be such a high demand on energy. And this is a big change in the development what we experience now. And now I will show you very fast and very shortly. Europe at the moment is determined by 3 very different building standards. And you see, I only named the numbers, and the main criteria to choose these building standards, it's not about technology, it's not about equipment, it's about the areas which you are used for different, and you know, all over the world you nearly do 2-room, 3-room, 4-room apartments, but the area you use for doing this is very different according to different countries, according to different backgrounds. But therefore, we talk a little bit about these different standards, about the low standard, medium standard, and high standard. And I will show you now very shortly some projects, what we do. The cheapest way to do housing, and we have quite a lot of experience with this, is to involve the people in and by using their own workforce to contribute to a project. And this can reduce the cost of the projects sometimes more than 50%. But for normal people, this question of price is so important. This is a very simple example of what we did. This is a social housing based on self-built strategies from the people. I can show you very shortly some other ones which we are doing with these technologies. You know, the low standard, it's the very small one. We used in a lot of developments for many years, and you know, maybe you will find out this is the medium standard already, and this is, for example, social housing. It's more than 300 apartments in one, concentrate in one, and this is one of the cheapest social housings which happened during this time. I don't want, but the price of this, the low price of this housing is very much related to these geometrical optimizations which are done by the architects I spoke in the beginning. And you know, they're all in different cities and all these cities have the different rules, different regulations, different values and things like this. Why are they so different? I told you before that all these buildings depend in a direct or indirect way on subsidies. And together with subsidies, you have a lot of regulations, but they are very different in each country, and you can always talk about which is the most efficient company and things like this, but this doesn't make so much sense. It's more that countries, and that's what I like in Europe a lot, that the countries try to reach their goals in a very different way. And this is one of the richnesses what we believe to see in Austria. Now I can go for this, and that's very simple. I'm sorry, but I could show you now hundreds of these projects, but I will not do. And for example, the organization of these projects is very much determined by cooperatives, by non-profit organizations, or even by the cities themselves. For example, Vienna, which is one of these examples of doing a very professional, very reasonable policy about housing. In Vienna, more than 30% of all apartments belong to the city himself. So the city is far the biggest developer. And you know, in Austria, for example, about 80% of all housing, either in property or in rental, are determined by these subsidies from government. And even more in Switzerland, but this is such a special model I would not like to show you. For example, this is an example in China, near Shanghai, about 150 kilometers north of Shanghai. And you know, when you remember what I said to you in the beginning, that we believe very much that what is the contribution to the public space. So this, you see in the layout of the plan, that's the very normal way of a Chinese city. Everything is orientated to the south. But between the buildings, you can imagine that there is no very specific public atmosphere, because this is only a repetition, and they are very unhappy about not having these nice public spaces. But at the same time, they have very clear values about orientations, but that's fine. And so what we try to do there, even with very big buildings, is to reorganize them in a way to do a more spatial relation between the different buildings there. And you know, this relation between different buildings, that's always what we work on, that's always what we are interested in. And you know, you can see the upper project is in Hanoi, and this is in Zurich, and it's okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, so there are a lot of them. And maybe, you know, the right project is a project which we did in about the year 2002 in Beijing. And this project is called MoMA. And you see there is a compromise possible, that southeast and south are accepted as orientations, so not anymore and only south. And you know, this is the first Chinese project with all the environmental technologies what we are used to nowadays. And the Chinese government and the officials of Beijing are very, very proud because it happened so early. And when you would do buildings nowadays, and even in Europe, on this technical standard, this is the state of the art, but it was done about 40 years ago. So what, and at last, I want to talk very short, what do we believe in future? And we did, I will show you two projects. And you know, the first project I show you is done in Amsterdam. And this is the owner of this project is the biggest housing cooperative in Amsterdam, having more than 20,000 apartments in Amsterdam themselves. And there is a director called Mr. Biedendijk, and this director had a very clear understanding. He did not want to decide anymore how big is an apartment, how the building is used, what it is good for, because when you do research about buildings, you will find out that the use of the building for which it is designed is normally not longer than one generation. But one generation is only about 20 to 25 years. But when we speak about economic interest or ecological impact of buildings, the lifetimes of buildings should be much, much longer. And that's the reason why understanding that the use of the building is the thing you change. So in the design, there is no use anymore fixed. So everybody can, this was very funny in this project. The project was rented on eBay. So people could rent, so they could offer for this kind of square meter at this corner or in this orientation, they will pay this and this. And you know, the result of this is like this. In the building, there is a small private hotel. There's 25% of social housing. There's 30% of not subsidized, not social housing. There is a Montessori kindergarten. There are companies, and that's very funny. There is a lot of architectural offices. So they could rent it, and that's what they did. So the mixture, when you would consider yourself how to do a building like this or how to write a program like this, you would never come up to this mind. But still, you know, I don't like to talk about all the technological necessities which you have to take, but this is quite important that You have to take very big spans, nearly no columns. The cores, the vertical organization become very important because they have to manage nearly everything. And the number of stores which are possible in the core will determine the possibility of separate the areas in different issues. You know, in the back of this thinking, there is also John Habraken, which you may know, and you know, he generated this movement of open building, which is quite successful in some countries in the world, that it's not anymore possible to fix walls and things like this in relation to a certain use. The second, what I want to tell you, this is a one step forward, because in this building, we eliminated all technology. This building is at the lake, it's at the border of Switzerland and Austria, and you know, there are cold winters, not so hot summers, but cold winters. The climate is very similar, but it's a little bit colder than here, than in Mexico City. The climate is very similar. And you know, there is no technology anymore. And when you don't have no technology anymore, you can imagine that the separation and the adaptation of use is even much more easy. So what happens in the building? In the building there is a yoga studio, there's architectural offices, there's a gallery, there's a small restaurant, there is a plastic surgery, there is a fitness studio, there are some offices, and there are some apartments. When you ever would consider to write a program like this, you would not be able to, but nothing is determined by the layout or by the technology anymore. What is the big change in technology? That's something very simple. We replace the traditional hardware of mechanical ventilation, of heating and cooling, by using software. A special developed software which is based on measuring the situations in the rooms will control the building. And it works now since a lot of years. And at the moment, we do about 42 buildings like this in Europe. Because for more and more people, the big advantage of this replacement of hardware by software is not only to reduce the energy demand, but what is even more important in future, to reduce the maintenance cost of buildings. So I'm sorry that I talk so much about cost, but European housing is determined by cost. I'm really sorry. And this is a very complex issue. And the question always is, what can architects contribute to this question or not? You know, there are some things which can be done to increase the density of the land, to optimize in geometrical terms your buildings, to optimize the technological knowledge about your building, and there are other things you cannot influence. There's the funding, the interest rates, and other things you cannot influence, but you have to accept them. So that's a very complicated balance. But what I want to say in general, when you speak about European housing, you must know European housing in the way when you go to Europe, you experience, has nothing to do with market. It's determined by the distribution of public money putting into housing. And there's a big, big political agreement about European countries nowadays that this is a strategy which we already did for 100 years, and we have to redo it even more strong than it was discussed during this period of the neoliberalism free market discussions which you also had over here. So thank you very much. And when you ask me what is important for me, there are two things. Reduce the cost of housing for normal people, to increase the quality of them, and to give them more opportunities to reorganize themselves in the way they want. Thank you very much.
Desde Barcelona nos acompaña Clara Solà Morales, arquitecta catalana. Con amplia trayectoria en el cruce entre docencia, investigación y práctica profesional, dirige el estudio Clara Solà Morales Arquitectura, enfocado en proyectos sensibles al contexto y a la memoria urbana. Demos la bienvenida a Clara Solà Morales, en alianza con Reurbano.
No. Aquí. Vas. Buenas tardes. Mientras sube esto aquí, aprovecho para dar las gracias por la invitación y a Reurbano por colaborar en esto y también por lo que verán al final. Voy a explicar un poquito de dónde viene la reflexión sobre vivienda. Voy a hablar básicamente de vivienda. Y, bueno, he hecho un poco de terapia colectiva, de dónde venía y hacia dónde vamos. Y creo que esto ahorita no está funcionando. O sea que me voy a quedar aquí. Si no me quedo, bien. Listo. ¿Y ahí voy a poder? Perfecto. En el primer curso de arquitectura en la Escuela de Barcelona, en una clase de proyectos, un profesor enseñó esta imagen y reclamaba el fijarnos en cómo las soluciones más sencillas o más vernaculares, la dificultad o como la falta de recursos llevaban a soluciones muy simples, ¿no? Y de hecho lo que estaba reclamando creo que estaba en lo que esta imagen de Charles Elsen para la publicación de Logier, ¿no? Sur l'architecture, venía a reclamar con la cabaña primitiva y como por un lado explicaba cómo la vivienda es un lugar de protección, pero también como la pureza y la simplicidad, ¿no? eran esenciales y sobre todo como el racional y la falta de ornamento aseguraban, ¿no? el construir este ethos, ¿no? esta esencia y pureza dentro de la arquitectura. Claro, todo esto pasaba a finales de los 90 y creo que tiene que ver también con los últimos coletazos del posmodernismo, ¿no? y cómo los profesores nos invitaban a no equivocarnos de camino, ¿no? Yo creo que dentro de lo que cabe aprendí e intenté ser simple, ser pura, ¿no? E ir bastante al origen de la tectónica a la cual se nos invitaba, de la geometría, han sido probablemente los instrumentos, ¿no? Lucía hablaba esta mañana de plantitis, yo creo que sufro de plantitis y seccionitis. Y veréis como muchos de estos proyectos, que son casas que han ido siendo como el motor del estudio, del estudio del despacho, pero también del estudio como de la investigación propia de la vivienda, se han ido convirtiendo en este camino, en convertirse, ¿no? en entender cómo funciona y en cómo estas secciones y plantas son un instrumento de trabajo. De la planta extrapolada a la volumetría, de la sección al alzado y demás. He aprovechado la conferencia para hacer un ejercicio de coger bastantes de las plantas de vivienda y entender un poco el proceso, ¿no? De esta plantitis de la que hablaba Lucía, entender cuál ha sido un poco el proceso desde esa necesaria geometría que parecía que era el inicio del proyecto, a la comprensión que todo esto siempre, y tiene que ver con la propia Escuela de Barcelona, va ligado a estrategias sobre el lugar y cómo la arquitectura responde a ese lugar y al programa, ¿no? Como al final todo acaba siendo una respuesta muy concreta, pero también, y creo que ha sido parte de este proceso y al que me quiero referir, cómo los patios han sido un instrumento cada vez más presentes en el trabajo como instrumento de trabajo, no necesariamente por necesidad, sino para vincular la vivienda a la naturaleza o al menos incorporar la naturaleza como parte de la experiencia de la vivienda, ¿no? Enseño aquí una imagen de un proyecto que está a punto de empezar construcción, que tiene que ver con eso, ¿no? Con poner al usuario y al patio como una estrategia de vinculación con el lugar y también de volver más complejo la relación entre los distintos espacios dentro de la propia vivienda. Para mí o para nosotros en el estudio, creo que cuando construimos no tiene que ver en construir espacios, sino como entender cómo el espacio lo que está haciendo es obligándonos a vivir de una cierta manera, ¿no? Como el espacio obliga a que nosotros convivamos de una cierta manera y nos relacionemos entre nosotros y con el exterior de cierta manera. Y saco aquí el proyecto de una alberca, donde desde la sección, ¿no? Lo que invita es, o lo que acota son las maneras en las que se puede vivir, ¿no? Y aquí en esta otra imagen, donde la forma de la arquitectura, esa geometría, invita a vivir de una cierta manera y también niega ciertas otras, ¿no? Me encanta esta frase de Spider-Man, de "With great power comes great responsibility", ¿no? Al final es un instrumento el que nosotros tenemos o es un poder, ¿no? O sea, es una responsabilidad que tenemos cuando nosotros pensamos en cómo serán estas viviendas, ya sean unifamiliares o plurifamiliares, el entender que lo que estamos es realmente construyendo la forma de relación entre nosotros. Una de las cosas que empezamos a hacer hace tiempo, que es intentar entender cuáles son las diferentes maneras en las que los diferentes usos que tiene una vivienda, ¿no? No voy a entrar en todos ellos, creo que todos sabemos más o menos de lo que estamos hablando. Y en un momento de ilusión vital, pensé que era un poco como con Ferran Adrià, no sé si lo conocen, cocinero súper reconocido, el Bulli, que lo que hizo fue deconstruir un poco lo que era una tortilla española, ¿no? La tortilla española, que la conocemos en esta forma, pero que puede ser de muchas otras maneras, ¿no? Probablemente la Casa Girasol es el principio de este ejercicio donde cada uno de estos usos toma un espacio y se vuelve como autónomo, ¿no? Se atomiza alrededor de este espacio central que acaba siendo la sala de estar. La sala de estar, ¿no? Pedí al despacho, supongo que me vienen muy boomer, cuáles eran las referencias que ellos tendrían para una sala de estar, ¿no? Y todas estas series que en el fondo están en nuestro imaginario, siempre es la relación que se da dentro de una casa, se da dentro alrededor de este sofá, ¿no? De esta mesa, de este sofá y demás. Así que lo que hicimos fue volver al ejercicio y entender exactamente en qué posición se encontraban estas salas de estar y qué relación tenían respecto a esos patios que habíamos hablado, a esos exteriores y demás. En una casa que estamos también empezando construcción, en París, os quiero enseñar solo uno de la presentación que usamos para el cliente, que tiene que ver explicar el lugar, la posición del sol, evidentemente todas estas cosas también están en el propio proyecto y dentro del discurso hicimos toda esta iteración de posibles soluciones al programa que se nos pedían con sus respectivas plantas y básicamente esto nos sirvió para concluir las estrategias de proyecto, ¿no? Y al final lo importante de todo esto no era solo, ¿no? Colocarnos atrás, ocupar todo el ancho y sobre todo, ¿no? Una partición porque eran dos viviendas que podía ser una, pero sobre todo y como gran momento del proyecto donde iba a estar este salón y cómo esto iba a estar estructurando la secuencia de espacios que venía a continuación. Bueno, al final este proyecto lo que acaba siendo han sido como estas dos unidades que se centran o que pivotan alrededor de este gran espacio, en este caso lateral, pero que organizan toda la vivienda. Y esta imagen que se ve poquito, o al menos yo la veo poco, tiene que ver con esa reflexión de esa primera imagen enseñada al primer curso de arquitectura, donde hablaban de construcción y técnica y de simplicidad. Para mí, yo creo que en este momento, si me tengo que posicionar, para mí la arquitectura es esto, ¿no? Es cómo convivimos, cómo nos obligamos a convivir y cómo la arquitectura nos acota en esa forma de vivir, ¿no? Cómo somos capaces de construir unas leyes que después el usuario sea capaz de adaptarlo a su uso, pero que seamos capaces de asegurar los mínimos de habitabilidad o de convivencia, ¿no? Sí, claro, seguro dirán, ¿no? Una viviendas unifamiliares es más fácil, ¿no? O esa reflexión parece que es una reflexión fácil. Para mí la vivienda unifamiliar es el corazón del pensamiento de qué significa habitar. Pero más allá de eso, ese mismo ejercicio trasladado a los edificios de vivienda colectiva ha pasado un poco lo mismo, ¿no? Como ese esfuerzo por ir metiendo el vacío como gran instrumento de relación. En estos últimos años, yo creo que entre los últimos 10, a lo mejor me estoy volviendo mayor y son más de 10, con esta condición más líquida de lo que significa la familia, estamos encontrando muchas formas distintas de vivir y creo que esto es una de las grandes discusiones centrales de qué significa las viviendas plurifamiliares, ¿no? Cómo daremos respuesta a toda esta nueva sistema. Me he apuntado aquí todo lo que significa porque hay tantos nombres que me pierdo, pero básicamente creo que responde a, ¿no?, todos estos modelos que más o menos hemos ido trazando, ¿no? Familias de muchos números, familias que cambian en el tiempo y también familias que deciden convivir, ¿no? La convivencia, los cohousings, los co-livings, los co-co-co-co. A pesar de ese primer ejercicio que habíamos hecho para las viviendas, yo creo que es extrapolable también a la vivienda colectiva y el entender cuáles son los usos que pueden darse aquí en azul en la condición de compartir, ¿no? ¿Qué usos se pueden llegar a compartir? Sin embargo, y a pesar que parece que cuando hablemos de vivienda colectiva lo importante o el foco lo estamos poniendo últimamente en cómo es este espacio de la convivencia colectiva, a nosotros nos sigue interesando mucho en cómo dentro de la unidad unifamiliar o cómo dentro de la unidad de esta familia que toma todas estas formas distintas, sigue siendo el corazón social, ¿no? El corazón que nos rige como sociedad, que es la convivencia. ¿Qué significa la sala de estar o qué significa ese sofá, ¿no? Richard Hamilton, en esta pintura de referencia casi histórica, construye esta especie de espacio alrededor de este espacio colectivo y donde todos los nuevos atributos, ¿no?, de consumo son incorporados, ¿no? De forma más exagerada aún en esta imagen también de los años 60 de un banco, ¿no?, para dar préstamos, y es sorprendente como al final la sala de estar acaba siendo esos pocos sofás aparcados en un lugar. Si nos vamos a los años 90, otro banco, ¿no?, el American Express, acaba relegando aún más, cada vez es menos importante esa sala de estar y cada vez es más importante lo que tenemos y menos importante cómo vivimos. En una instalación que hay en este momento en el pabellón de Barcelona, de Mies van der Rohe, una instalación hecha por Xevi Bayona, que es arquitecto y artista, intenta explicar dónde está una de las razones en las que el usuario construye esta domesticidad, ¿no? Aquí una imagen donde él dice que tiene que ver con el mobiliario, con las pertenencias, con toda esta mochila que la historia nos va cargando, y aquí la explicación real de esa foto, que él lo que ha hecho es suspender del techo todo ese patrimonio acumulado con la historia. Para mí, Wright hablaba de la chimenea como centro crucial de la vivienda, ¿no? Creo que lo que es importante de esa chimenea no es la chimenea per se, sino dónde está colocada, ¿no? La centralidad de esa vivienda. En las cuevas prácticamente vernaculares de Granada, la sala de estar acaba siendo ese corazón de la cual acaban colgando todos los distintos usos. Y para mí esa centralidad va también atada con ser el punto de anclaje de relación con el exterior, ¿no? Como la ventana y la exposición a lo que puede pasar, ya sea lo colectivo o la calle o lo público, son un vínculo indispensable. Me refiero aquí a 3 plantas de 3 colegas. Hablaba también Lucía hace un rato, como en España, en especial en Cataluña, hay una política de vivienda que está siendo extremadamente propositiva en su discurso y en su forma, y me he aprovechado aquí de 3 amigos que les he robado sus plantas, Peristoral, Ac Arquitectas y Bosc Capdaferro. Podría haber cogido también Cierto Estudio, Mayo, otros tanto. Y existe este discurso en el que se apuesta por la flexibilidad, ¿no? Hay esta preocupación porque estas nuevas formas de vivir construyan la manera de ocupar el espacio. Para mí, y para entrar en conflicto, lo que me preocupa realmente es que en este momento donde las plantas son completamente horizontales, digamos, donde son isótropas, el valor de todas las estancias, es verdad que uno puede moverse y puede decidir, pero hemos perdido ese punto de convivencia, ¿no? Ese punto de convivencia tiene el mismo valor que una habitación. Aparecía hace unos días un anuncio, el 2 de mayo, en el periódico, donde los pisos compartidos de estudiantes, el salón, el living, había desaparecido, ¿no? Se había pasado a ser la suma de habitaciones, ¿no? Y yo me pregunto, como arquitecta, ¿qué responsabilidad tenemos nosotros respecto a eso, ¿no? O sea, cómo la geometría, cómo la forma, cómo la manera de pensar la vivienda colectiva tiene que ver en eso, ¿no? En estarnos borrando en lo que para mí es lo más importante que tenemos como sociedad, que es el convivir. Habraken tenía, ¿no?, todo este pensamiento, desde el soporte ínfil a la definición de estas estructuras o sistemas sobre el cual definía qué era lo que podía ser incremental o lo que no podía ser incremental, y regía un cierto orden sobre este crecimiento. Voy a usar y voy a entrar muy rápido sobre un proyecto que tiene que ver con este pensamiento, sobre un proyecto que estamos presentando dentro de una semana escasita en una exposición que se va a hacer en Princeton sobre casas utópicas. Hemos hecho un pequeño proyecto que tiene que ver con esto, ¿no? Y voy un poco rápido porque si no me voy a comer el tiempo, en intentar volver este esquema de centralidad del salón como un sistema de relaciones entre los espacios, ¿no? Y al final como el patio y esta especie de triangulación entre los usos primarios y los secundarios de la vivienda acaba construyendo este sistema que por geometría puede ser incremental, ¿no? Y puede ser desde una unidad primaria a una unidad mucho más grande. Fotos de la maqueta que se presenta la semana que viene. Y cómo este sistema, ¿no?, que tiene que ver con este sistema incremental, después en este mismo pensamiento puede llegar a tomar formas, ¿no?, en que el mismo sistema espacial puede tomar formas distintas. Otra de las cosas que nos ocupa como despacho tiene que ver en cómo usamos el patrimonio, ¿no? O sea, cómo nos está tocando, especialmente en Europa, y vuelvo a la casa unifamiliar y vuelve a ser un experimento, es un encargo que nos han hecho, estamos en plena obra, en cómo todo este pensamiento se incorpora cuando estamos hablando sobre obra construida, ¿no? En este caso, sobre derrumbe construido, ¿no? Esto era la casa, patrimonialmente nos obligan a recuperar esa estructura inicial. y hemos dibujado primero en un lado lo que queda y dos, lo que debería haber sido la casa original. La casa es desde el siglo XV-XVI y cómo ha ido evolucionando en el tiempo. Voy a intentar ir un poco rápido. Y cómo esta casa nosotros intentamos, y aquí tiene que ver con esta experimentación, ¿no? Cómo intentamos entender que por patrimonio tenemos que guardar por su valor patrimonial, que tenemos que guardar por estructura y qué tenemos que guardar o qué queremos priorizar como lugares primordiales, ¿no? Sobre eso y en mi manera de funcionar o nuestra manera de funcionar, lo que haríamos es coger uno de estos espacios e intentar, ¿no?, ver cómo tiene que pivotar sobre estos espacios principales, ir sobre un lugar o sobre otro. Y hicimos toda la exploración y al final decidimos hacer una apuesta donde en vez de apostar por uno u otro lado, decidimos apostar por los dos, ¿no? Intentar entender que lo importante era mantener la dualidad de dos espacios de convivencia y trabajar el punto central como el gran meollo del proyecto. Lo que hemos hecho es, en este espacio, que era probablemente el más oscuro, hemos construido un vacío que es el que finalmente construye una cierta circulación y que vincula estos dos espacios, uno será de invierno, otro será de verano, por las condiciones climáticas y propias de cada uno de estos espacios, y la casa se acaba construyendo en una cosa que creo que aquí en México le llaman un sube-baja, si no me equivoco, ¿no? Y el proyecto está haciendo un esfuerzo en construir, ¿no?, esta especie de condición que luego se da también en vivienda colectiva, en cómo somos capaces de convivir con dos espacios distintos que cambian según el uso y el momento del espacio. Bueno, el problema que hemos solucionado en planta ha tenido que resolucionarse en sección y todo esto viene involucrado con un trabajo de jardinería y de espacio. Esto es que ha resuelto Martí Frank maravillosamente. No voy a entrar en el detalle de dentro. El gran esfuerzo ha sido en la deconstrucción y el pensar, entender cuál era la esencia de la casa, los existentes y crecer esta casa dentro de una cierta lógica de la construcción de este límite perimetral que es lo patrimonial, ¿no? Hemos hecho muchas pruebas de muro ciclópeo, donde para poder utilizar el 100% de la piedra existente y usarlo con mortero de cal al sistema antiguo, ¿no?, para intentar amortizar lo máximo posible el sistema constructivo antiguo, actualizándolo. La obra a día de hoy y esta dualidad de la que estábamos hablando, ¿no? Evidentemente el proyecto, la parte contemporánea, digamos, o la parte de reinterpretación tiene que ver en cómo hemos acotado el trabajo en sección y cómo las cubiertas son nuevas, y aquí sí el trabajo es de construcción de esta especie como de sándwich, donde las partes nuevas están hechas en hierro, ¿no?, en un lenguaje mucho más frío, contra este espacio mucho más cálido que tiene que ver con la piedra existente, y en cómo reconstruimos este patio que acabará siendo, ¿no?, el pivote entre el vacío y el lleno, el patio que en este momento está en estas condiciones. Aquí en México, y también trabajando sobre el valor del patio, y me voy a vivienda colectiva, a minutos escasos de aquí, en Bucareli, existe esta vivienda que se encuentra sobre el eje de Bucareli, que es un eje que, como saben, es bastante ruidoso, en el cruce con Donde, ¿no?, se localizan. Básicamente está al lado del reloj chino, ¿no? El esfuerzo hablando mal, ¿no?, como el punto más complejo fue la geometría del lugar, ¿no?, y el valor patrimonial que tenía esta plaza circular, a la cual nosotros creímos que había que dar respuesta, y después de muchas pruebas creímos que tenía que dar respuesta de forma circular también, ¿no?, identificando que la fachada tenía que ser una fachada construida para construir la circularidad de esta plaza. Nos aventamos si vamos con círculo vamos a todo, así que construimos, ¿no?, este juego de círculos para arriba y para abajo, y acabamos de acotar lo que sería el terreno y extruimos ese mismo volumen a máximos para luego trabajarlo y adaptarlo a los edificios colindantes, después de haber hecho un patio que me he saltado uno de los esquemas. El edificio es este de acá. Y básicamente, y aquí vemos este esfuerzo, ¿no?, de a pesar de construir un edificio que se impone en un entorno bastante patrimonial, lo que hace es intentar dar manos, ¿no?, a los edificios colindantes. ¿Cómo da manos, ¿no? En esta volumetría que habíamos extruido, lo que ha hecho es intentar bajar en su volumetría, adaptarse tanto en juego de fachada como en juego de volumetría para ir a jugar con los edificios vecinos, como vemos en este lado, ¿no?, de la fachada principal, como baja para ir a buscar la cota del edificio de al lado. Hay también un ejercicio de lenguaje que tiene que ver con entender que los edificios patrimoniales, y no necesariamente tanto patrimoniales, pero sí existentes alrededor, el gran protagonismo que tiene la ventana y ese vacío, ¿no?, ese juego de ritmo del vacío, y identificar que el edificio probablemente tenía que jugar al mismo juego, ¿no?, acabando construyendo esta fachada que se adapta a los laterales, pero que juega también con este vaciado. Esa fachada acaba siendo no solo un juego de vacío, sino también un elemento estructural. Vemos aquí en obra este juego, ¿no?, que acaba marcando el eje y que acabará marcando también la pauta distributiva dentro de los apartamentos, ¿no? Y aquí viene, yo creo que el gran juego del edificio, que tiene que ver en la tipología, ¿no?, y en este juego de qué significa la sala de estar y cómo conseguimos centralizar ese esfuerzo. Por un lado, queda claro que si juegas a circunferencias, juegas a radios, y ante la discusión si los edificios tenían que ser pasantes o los departamentos tenían que ser pasantes, se toma la decisión que no, que lo que vamos a priorizar son las fachadas, ¿no?, cuanta más fachada mejor, y que por lo tanto, cuanto más fachada también significa más posibilidad de que esa sala de estar o ese núcleo tenga más juego, ¿no? Con lo cual eso significa que en vez de hacer pasarelas, lo que se hace es un pasillo central que distribuye estos espacios que van a ser, ¿no?, reglados por la propia fachada. Dentro de la importancia que tiene el vaciado que hemos hecho, este núcleo central, los núcleos de comunicaciones lo que hacen es empoderar o poner en situación este espacio central de en medio, y se colocan en este punto central del patio. Y se acaba de cerrar ese patio con dos elementos que acabarán también dando escala al propio edificio y que necesariamente van a ser tipológicamente distintos por no encontrarse dentro del propio radio. Las aguas, y especialmente las cocinas, las aguas se colocan de forma radial y serán las cocinas las que marcarán la pauta entre las distintas viviendas. Y existe luego otro lenguaje, que son los closets, que son un elemento autónomo, que depende de los apartamentos, serán móviles incluso, que serán los que establecerán una segunda jerarquía dentro de esos espacios bastante continuos. Y después el verde como instrumento de desgranaje de estos extremos de los que ya hemos hablado. Les muestro aquí un plano que me encanta, que tiene que ver con cómo hicimos para poder intentar sistematizar el craso error arquitectónico, digamos, de hacer un edificio curvo con todas las tipologías distintas y demás. Lo que hicimos fue hacer que todas las cocinas y todos los armarios, o sea, que todos los elementos que eran propios de cada departamento fueron sistematizados y desgranados, generando, ¿no?, como tipo A, tipo B, tipo C, para intentar facilitar, perdón, reurbano, porque seguro que no fue fácil, un sistema construido que tenía que ver con todos estos tipos que se iban como montando, ¿no? El edificio, con este valor como súper importante de la fachada que juega, ¿no?, acaba siendo este array de departamentos que se van organizando de forma radial alrededor de la plaza, pero también alrededor del patio, generando unas secciones que vuelven más compleja esta escalada y estos departamentos, y sobre todo donde existen estos vacíos, y me he pasado la diapo, que tiene que ver con los núcleos, que lo que acaba haciendo es intentar romper la continuidad de esta fachada que acaba siendo tan densa, ¿no? En el patio interior, tanto en los extremos de estas dos tipologías como en los dos núcleos acaban generando, ¿no?, este espacio de vaciado que le da ritmo y le da ritmo y sobre todo le da un poco de aire a este espacio central. Al final, lo que acaba siendo es que el acceso da espacio a este living, ¿no?, que acaba siendo siempre como el corazón del apartamento, y la forma de ir lidiando con los otros departamentos acaba siendo, como decía, a través de estos elementos, a veces móviles, a veces fijos, que son los closets. Al final el patio acaba siendo, a pesar de que en planta se ve radicalmente pequeño, acaba siendo el pulmón del proyecto, y existe esa continuidad visual al menos entre lo que es el salón, entre lo que son las habitaciones, regladas por estas ventanas, como decía, con este espacio central, con estos vaciados que marcan los cambios de geometría y que le dan a escala, y acaba construyendo este espacio verde que es realmente el pulmón del proyecto. Muchas gracias.
Somos Naturgy México, líderes en la distribución y comercialización de gas natural. Estamos comprometidos con impulsar la transición energética del país a través de soluciones energéticas seguras que reducen costos, disminuyen el impacto ambiental y contribuyen a proyectos urbanos más eficientes. Gas natural Naturgy, la energía sustentable para tus diseños arquitectónicos. Visita naturgy.com.mx para más información.
Desde Bruselas nos acompaña Pier Vittorio Aureli, arquitecto, teórico y profesor en la Architectural Association de Londres y en la Universidad de Yale. Es reconocido por su aproximación crítica y radical a la arquitectura y al urbanismo, vinculada a la filosofía y la política contemporánea. Demos la bienvenida a Pier Vittorio Aureli.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, I was supposed to speak at the last Mextrópolis conference last year, but a very last minute incident prevented me to come here and to present. So I'm happy that I was, I was invited again. And I will actually do the presentation I was supposed to do last year, but slightly updated because I was going actually last year to show an ongoing project that we completed, in fact, meanwhile. And of course, this project is presented on behalf of Dogma, which is a practice I co-founded with Martino Tattara. And one, perhaps, aspect of our practice is that we do a lot of research, which is by design, but also by often historical inquiries on specific typologies, on specific architectural topics. And this is exactly what I will present you today. In fact, this is a study and project on the topic of the urban villa, which I will explain in a moment. The urban villa is a very common European housing type, which was born out of speculation. In fact, it is an offspring of the villa. But the hypothesis of this study is to see the urban villa as actually potential ideal type for affordable and social housing. That was a bit, let's say, in fact, intention of this project. Before I explain what the urban villa is, let me say that this study is part of a longer research trajectory, which Martino and I started many years ago, I would say maybe 12, almost 15 years ago, on the architecture of domestic space. When we started this research, we felt that for some reason this topic was kind of neglected by that time, by, let's say, what you can call the mainstream architectural discourse. Today, as you have seen also in the previous presentations, this is not actually the case, and I think this is a very positive development, in my opinion. Here you see the covers of 3 books that we have produced in the last 10 years. The first one on the white cover is a research on the history of the private room. The one in the middle, the yellow cover, is a history of minimum dwelling and its discontents. And the third one, the blue cover, is actually a history of the longhouse, which this book is not yet published, will be published hopefully at the beginning of next year. One specific aspect of these studies is that we use, of course, text, because we also write a lot, but also drawing. For us, drawing is a very important ways to analyze and read architecture. I mean, it seems obvious, but often in many scholarship about architecture, redrawing or making interpretation through drawing is not very common, but this is very much at the core of our way of looking to these case studies, which are often have a very long and rich history. And this is very much the case also of the project I will show you tonight, which is dedicated to the urban villa. So, in a nutshell, the urban villa is a 5, sometimes 6-story building. It usually has a quite generous fenestration and even balconies. And as you can see from this example, is actually free on all 4 sides. This is really, the reason for that is because, as I said before, the urban villa is an offspring of the villa, but often the urban villa is built in very dense cities. In fact, density is one of the main speculative aspects of the urban villa. It's actually a very common type, extremely average, I would say, in many European cities. There are even almost entire cities built with this type, like Rome, as you can see from this example, but also Lausanne, and peripheries of cities like Stuttgart or Dresden. So it's not really a special, let's say, typology. It was very dear to upper but also middle class, and as you will see, there are also very interesting examples of affordable versions of the urban villa. In spite of its popularity, actually, people tend to be very happy to live in this typology. That was one of our, let's say, experience. In spite of this popularity of the urban villa, there is not much research on this type, also because the urban villa was really the outcome of very hardcore speculation. So modern architects were often very critical of this type. My professors actually almost forbid us to design urban villas. In Italy, we call them palazzinas, which is very dispregiative, also derogative name that is given to this type. But there is actually one interesting exception to this lack of scholarship on the urban villa, which is this famous research carried by the German architect Oswald Matthias Ungers with collaborators at the time, Hans Kolloff and Arthur Ovaska, which actually proposed this type as an ideal form of housing, collective housing, that would work well, especially with cooperative housing or affordable housing, and would, in Unger's intention at that time, so we are talking about the late 70s, the urban villa was a sort of alternative between the two extreme forms of housing that were very popular at that time, the large housing estate and of course the single family house. So in a way the urban villa was really a sort of third type against this sort of dichotomy that was very strong at that time. So our project consisted, first of all, in an exhibition. We use often exhibitions as a sort of medium to put forward our research and projects. This exhibition took place in Antwerpen, or Antwerp, which is a city in Belgium. We are based in Brussels. We were invited by the Flanders Architectural Institute to do an exhibition, and we decided to take this opportunity to finally produce this research that we have been working for many years. And the exhibition really displayed the two layers of our study. On the wall, there is a sort of history of the urban villa through 40 case studies. We were especially interested in showing the evolution of the urban villa from the villa. And this is something I will do also today, of course, in a much shorter version. And then on the table, there were a series of projects, some of them projects that we have completed in the last year. Some of them were competitions, some of them were more research projects. And then on the other table, there was a project for the city of Antwerp that we discussed, or we somehow developed with the relationship with the city architect of the city. And this project, as you will see, is a plan for affordable housing for the city of Antwerp. The city of Antwerp has quite a strong shortage of housing, especially affordable housing. So we thought that the exhibition could have been a sort of way to present to the city a possible, I wouldn't say solution, because I think solution of the housing crisis for me is a very complex issue that goes far beyond what architects can do, but nevertheless would be really a sort of venue where to initiate a discussion of what kind of form affordable housing can have. And of course, for us, the urban villa could be a very strong candidate for a new form of affordable and social housing. So this let's say, double register of research and or historical research and design, and research by design is a little bit the structure also of what I'm going to present you today. So I'll start with a very brief excursus of how actually the urban villa came into being. For us, this was a very interesting research, almost interesting on its own, even though, of course, this had consequence also in our project. And of course, as I said before, we were interested to understand how the urban villa, in a way, was born out of the most unlikely type when we talk about affordable collective housing, which is actually the villa. Now, you might know that this type, the villa, is the most enduring type in the history of architecture. It exists since 2000 years. I don't think there is an architectural type that is so enduring. And it was invented literally by the ancient Romans, who, although built a lot of cities, especially when it came to the elite, they also hated to live in cities. And when they had enough capital, they would buy property actually in the countryside. sorry. And they would actually build a large estate, which was known as latifundio. And at the center of the estate, they would actually build a villa, which usually was a palace, but what's happening with the, I don't know. So you have to work with your imagination. So that will be an interesting experiment. I will try to speak and rely on my words rather than on images. Anyway, the villa actually was a palace that had one crucial feature, which was the loggia. So a villa would be often a building with a generous loggia, and this loggia would really increase and monumentalize the relationship between the building and the landscape. Of course, needless to say that villas were colonial entities that were really meant to gentrify the countryside, which until the late Republic was still a place for peasants. And the villa, actually, the Roman villa declined with the decline of the Roman Empire and is suddenly resurrected in the 15th century, especially in Tuscany, when very wealthy families again started to, let's say, invest on this type. They didn't know any archaeological evidence of it, but they knew very well the literature that described villas. And maybe the most famous example of these early 15th century villas were the Medici villas, the villas built by this very wealthy family as also a form of investment. And again, one characteristic that is very peculiar of the villa at this point is these loggias that open up the building to its surrounding landscape, and also this compact cubic almost form that made the villa very adaptable to very steep topographies. Of course, this trend of villas became very popular, and they became very distinct architectural projects. This is another very interesting example, another Medici villa, where you see that essentially the villa is a palace, but unlike urban palace, there is a very strong relationship to the outside landscape, which here is made especially through this monumental loggia topped by a pediment, and by this generous balcony that enclose and surround actually the villa and open up, in fact, the villa to its context. But in its evolution, especially in the Baroque period, villas became smaller because they were often built very nearby cities. They were used as a kind of suburban retreat that could be reached in few hours. So villas were really made as small houses where owners could even spend a day outside the city. And at this point, in fact, the villa becomes what in Baroque Rome was known as casino, or a small house. So the estate, as you can see, the park, the garden was very monumental, but in fact, the habitation itself was very small. And in fact, it's at this point that the villa becomes more of a little palace that later on would really fit into the dense fabric of the city. This passage is represented very well by this example that for us was very inspiring, which is the new pavilion by Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Charlottenburg, Berlin. As you might know, this unassuming building was built just next to the big royal palace as a very relaxed, let's say, habitation made of very simple rooms, let's say, designed through this very diagrammatic, almost 9-square grid. Unlike the previous example, the center is no longer a big monumental space, but is actually the vertical circulation. And one of the most really, I would say, beautiful feature of this pavilion is this balcony that really open up the villa to its surrounding. And In fact, this is the moment in which even monarchs really enjoy this very bourgeois way of living, which was very different from the large palaces where they would usually held courts. Now, what is interesting is that it's exactly in the 19th century, second half of 19th century, that this model of villa becomes really popular as a upper middle class residence, and is often built as subdivisions. And as you can see, although they retain this cubic isolated form, because the land pressure, they were built in very close proximity. These are very interesting examples from actually Stuttgart and Dresden. Unlike actually the previous example, the whole villa was not owned by one single owner, but by multiple owners. Often there would be either one or even two apartments per floor. And of course, this typology became, since then, extremely successful, especially as a way to compensate the lack of, let's say, capital to buy actually large estates, but still having this sort of almost bucolic typology in the suburbs of large cities. And in fact, this typology became so popular that density increased. And as you can see, often the space in between buildings is actually very narrow, and this has been always the point of criticism to the urban villa, that somehow it's so speculative that density completely overrule any possible rule. But our hypothesis is that it's exactly this density that is creating a very interesting urban fabric, which combine, in fact, density with a certain generosity of open space. And in fact, it's interesting that in the 20th century, for a very short period, the urban villa became also a model for social housing. This is something that has been largely forgotten. But there is one interesting twist when urban villas start to become material for social housing. So they are no longer actually designed as suburban subdivisions, following the model of the single-family house, but they start to form like blocks. They're designed like blocks. This is a very interesting example of social housing in Milan, the Società Umanitaria, which in fact is a series of urban villas clustered around a garden. And in the garden, there are collective facilities for the inhabitants, and also on the ground floor of the block, especially towards the street, the main street, there are shops. So it's a very kind of multi-functional, but also very rich in terms of collective programs urban block. And in fact, at this point, the design of the urban villa, when it comes to social housing, is no longer just by one villa ad hoc, but it's really trying to create this sort of urban entity. And interestingly enough, this model had a short period of success between the 20s and 30s in New York. In fact, the urban villa in New York is known as garden apartment. There are very beautiful examples. And here you see actually the famous first houses, the very first public housing project built in US. And it was built actually in a very dense area, which is the Lower East Side, mostly made of tenements, which, as you might know, have almost no, let's say, access to air, because most of the building is actually very much clustered by the neighboring buildings. And in fact, the urban villa was chosen as a way to open up a bit of gap around these buildings. And in fact, the first houses came with a small garden that was in fact one of the very first attempts to implement the garden apartment as social housing. There are also a very interesting example of cooperative housing designed with this type. This is actually the Dunolly Garden in Jackson Heights in New York. And you see actually that urban villas are incredibly tight. So when you see these images, you might think that the spaces in between are very almost claustrophobic. But in fact, when you visit them, these spaces in between actually are quite beautiful, almost picturesque in their wealth of different atmosphere and experiences. So out of this research, we somehow drafted a series of points that for us were a sort of abecedere, if you want, of the urban villa. So urban villas are neither too small nor too big. There is always a coexistence of density and open space and of multiple functions. And I think this is a very strong quality of this type. Because actually they are relatively small, they can work both as infill, and this is maybe very interesting for our contemporary condition, but also they can form ensemble. And the proper scale is very much, their scale is makes them very good for non-commodifiable forms of ownership, like cooperative, CLT, which stands for Community Land Trust, public housing. And of course, because the small, medium size, so there are not many people living in urban villa, like actually large-scale social estates, they offer a certain possibility of sharing domestic and affective labor, as we have seen in some of the examples of urban villas social housing. So now I step to the second part of our project, which was this plan for affordable housing in Antwerp. It's a kind of theoretical project, so it's, if you want, something that was not meant to be built, but as in many of our projects, we really try to be as realistic as possible in taking really in account the whole nitty-gritty of what is to build today social housing. So the first things that we did in collaboration with the city architect of Antwerp was to make an atlas of available land, that most of which is owned by the city, which is a big advantage because the city could negotiate, bargain very good terms with the agencies that eventually would build housing in the city. You know that one of the biggest problems of building affordable housing today is the cost of land, essentially. I mean, 70% of the cost of housing today is actually the cost of land. So it's very important that cities support the building of any form of affordable housing by, in fact, leasing this land for no cost or with some kind of, let's say, good deal with whom actually build non-profit housing. And in fact, our project was based on a policy that, in fact, we took from other examples of successful, in our opinion, policies for affordable housing. So the project consists of two kinds of housing, social housing, which is mostly for tenants, so people that rent. And this housing is built by housing associations and rented to tenants, or affordable housing, which means that the cost of this housing is not more than 30% of the income of the people who are going to live there. And they're based on two possible forms of ownership. One could be still rental, but the other one could also be either cooperative housing, community land trust, or it could be also private housing, but subsidized by housing agency. I think this mix is very important because in many cities in Belgium, you cannot build more than 5% of social housing in a specific area. So it was very important to create this sort of composition of different forms of affordable housing. And then we thought that there were 2 points important to address. First one, that this housing, whatever their ownership model is, should be based on cooperation, which means cooperation of reproductive activities, but also in the flexibility of the subdivision of the living units. So this is actually a very important point, and it was addressed also before. Today, families actually are very flexible, often very volatile entities, and there should be some sort of protocol that allow certain apartments to shrink and certain apartments to expand according to the different phases of a family. And the last but not least point is the land policy. So what I explained before, there should be some sort of temporary lease of public land to non-profit housing, or there should be some trading of fiscal incentives in order to encourage private owners to give a land for a moderate price. In terms of typology, the urban villa, of course, should be a building free on all 4 sides. It should not be actually, should be either from 3 to 5 floors. The ground floor should be a more public program that can also be rented to commercial activities. There should be balconies all around. This was a very important principle for us. Apartments should always face 2 or sometimes even 3 sides, which is again also very important to increase also the efficiency of exposure of these apartments. And the last floor, the roof should be actually for communal activities, so activities that are shared among the inhabitants of the urban villa. So once we have established these principles and defined the areas in the city where new development could happen, we selected pilot projects with different characteristics. So Antwerp is a city that has a very strong historical core with very large blocks, but with some space actually inside these blocks. And then there are a lot of suburban sites, again made of blocks with much more generous land. So we realized that this model could fit very well in this situation where there is already actually a lot of buildings, so not much space is left. So for example, in this case, the urban villas take place only inside the block, the urban block of the city, as you can see. Because this land is public, it was very important that not all the land would be occupied by housing in order to retain also these areas of public green space. And in fact, in our intentions, this new, let's say, mass of urban villas should also act as a frame that makes accessible this public green inside these urban blocks. And there is also an interesting case, which is the Europa Park, one of the largest social housing estate in Belgium, actually perhaps the largest one, very important social housing estate, where there is actually a lot of empty land, and so we thought that perhaps a retrofitting of this area would offer a lot of room for urban villas. And we were very much interested in this kind of contrast of scale between the existing slabs and these smaller buildings, but we were also interested to form, together with the existing buildings, some sort of blocks that could really increase, in fact, the collective use of this space in between the big slabs. Typologically, urban villa is based on a few principles. The service cores are always in the middle, so there is this kind of onion structure from the core to the balconies. The wet cores, like kitchens and bathrooms, are always compact into specific points in order to have more efficient construction of this floor plan, and also to create less obstruction for their flexible use. Everything is very modular because this would allow a sort of negotiation also in terms of apartment size. in a much more rational way, and the load-bearing structure is the core and then the facade. So this allow, in fact, the subdivision of the apartment to be in time negotiated and create different size. This is actually a section of a typical building, and there are three aspects that for us were very important. Of course, the balconies, the cores, the wet cores that are all, let's say, concentrated in few points. And the windows are all the same, and there are door windows. Because the balconies are all around, we almost erase the difference between a window and a door, so that also the balcony would act almost as an open-air corridor, as a sort of external gallery. And then, of course, this matrix would allow different size of apartments that eventually could also transform in time from small, medium, big apartments. And, of course, the possibility for every floor or every second floor to have a shared room that could be used by all the inhabitants of one floor or two floors as a sort of collective child care or elderly care, or even a collective kitchen. So here you see the carcass of these urban villas that somehow typologically are really a sort of abstraction of the almost ideogram of the traditional villa, with these generous loggias all around. Of course, the different forms are a way to adapt this building to as many sites as possible. And this is actually one possible interpretation, where in fact having the wet cores concentrated in a few points and the load-bearing facade and the core, the subdivision of rooms is actually more flexible. And I don't know if you can see from these plans, but often the walls that goes against the perimeter wall, the outer wall, have a door between the facade and this wall, so that people could also move through the different rooms, not only through the corridor, which also act as a storage, but also as an enfilade of rooms connected by this, by the facade. So I'll show you now a few images just to give you an atmosphere of how this form of social and affordable housing can really look like in the city. As I said before, many times these sites are inside existing blocks. So in a way, you always enter a block. So there is this kind of threshold that becomes almost the gate to this new housing estates. Very important aspect is this density, is this proximity that for us allow a certain pleasant atmosphere to be very present in housing, especially also for the neighbors, because as I said before, the ground floor is actually made of public programs that are open also to the people that live on the housing around. This was a very important aspect in order to also win the consensus of those that own properties around to accept to have this new housing built in their backyard, let's say. But for us, it was very important to think the urban villa as a housing that creates a certain specific fabric that allow always this open space to be as important as the building itself. So for example, by using the checkboard grid, you would have this sort of AB fabric where urban villas are always aggregated around a sort of square or courtyard. A very important aspect, of course, are the balconies, very generous, that almost act also connect different rooms. So they are almost, as I said before, a parallel corridor. And in a way, in case an apartment is divided in two independent apartments, somehow the gallery will never be, I mean, at least that's the intention of the project, is never going to be divided. So the idea was to keep these balconies always open. This is actually something that is starting to appear in many cooperative housing in Germany, for example, where many different private apartments share at least actually the balcony that becomes almost a sort of common courtyard for neighboring dwellers. And another aspect that for us is important in the urban villa is this porosity, the idea that unlike actually the block, which is a very popular type in contemporary Europe, I mean, one of the favorite typologies of neoliberal Europe is the 19th century urban block. And often the block really create a very strict distinction between inside and outside. The urban villa, on the contrary, always leave this sort of ambiguity between what is inside and what is outside and allow this porosity to cut across the urban fabric. And of course, we were also interested in this relationship with the existing buildings. Often these buildings are, as in this case, very big. What you see on the back is one of those social housing slabs of the Europa Park. And so this contrast between the, let's say, the low rise and the high rise for us was a very interesting way to, in a way, retrofit this existing social housing without actually allowing the demolition of them. This is a very important, perhaps implicit argument of this project, that these housing estates should not be demolished, but they have enough space perhaps to host more social and affordable housing. As you can see from these images also were done to demonstrate that this infill would not ruin also the existing housing estates. And some few images of the interior. You see this sort of enfilade space against the outer facade, where with a sliding door, 2 rooms becomes almost like an ensemble. Also the idea that in urban villas, apartments are always facing the corner. So you have this sort of different views in different direction. And again, actually, a view of the enfilade around actually the outer facade with this generous fenestration made of these window doors that blur the distinction between, let's say, the facade and the interior. And finally, an image of this core, the vertical circulation, from which the common room, the shared room, is directly accessible. So in a way, vertical circulation really becomes the public space, not just the circulation, but also the public space of the community that inhabit the urban villa, which in a way fits very well in this building because, as I mentioned before, numbers of dwellers in an urban villa are, let's say, not exceeding the possibility to form actually quite, let's say, consistent communities. And so in a way, this idea of sharing become more feasible than with other, let's say, housing types that are either too individualistic, like suburban houses, or perhaps too big, like large social housing blocks. So this is actually maybe the last image of my presentation. As I mentioned before, this project is very peculiar, very focused on a very specific type and on a very specific city, but builds up on a research that for us really address the project of housing, which we strongly believe is the most important project for architecture. Thank you.
Daremos un breve receso de 5 minutos. Gracias.